Hi, Darshana. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Anne Marie. I am genuinely delighted to be here.
Me too. It was interesting because before we got online, I was recalling, how we met. So we were in Somatica, which is for listeners, that's a body based, somatic based sexuality and relationship coaching. And I just remember this really sweet moment. We were in a puppy pile in the back of the room, and you were talking about, I don't even remember the content, but I remember your spirit was so fiery and you were so like alive in what you were saying. I was like, who is this person? I think it was the year that I was assisting and you were assisting. So anyway, it's so delightful because I track you on Facebook. So it's really fun to actually have this chance to dive in with you about this topic that we're both so passionate about,
Yeah, and I like
eroticism.
hearing what the formative experience was.
Yeah, exactly. I know. Yeah,
I
it
was
was.
I was I was tracking your really sharp sense of fashion, actually.
Oh,
So it was
really?
way more superficial. I was always like, "Damn, Anne Marie looks good. She's putting effort into this."
I love it. Yoga pants.
Yeah.
Uh, well, so what I wanted to explore with you today is actually, I'll just lay out what I was imagining, and then you and
Sure.
I will take it wherever we want to go. So we're both in this realm of working with sexuality, eroticism, erotic power, and I would love to explore your own journey with how you came to be into this work. And
Mhm.
then secondly, I thought it could be interesting for us to talk about sexuality as sort of a gateway to awakening and to embodiment and the power
Mhm.
that it holds for us to heal
Mhm.
trauma, heal connection, heal attachment wounding.
Yeah.
Ooh, I love just watching you take that piece
Yeah.
in.
Yeah, I mean, because those two things are so synchronistic in my experience. If I speak about
Yes.
my own journey, it's very much that journey, the way in
Mm.
which choosing to explore sex. And for me, I'm very deliberate at this point in speaking about eroticism primarily, um, because to me, the erotic includes our sexuality, but it includes so much more than that. And
Yes.
what began as a journey exploring my sexuality has evolved to this point, and that's very much the essence of what's going on with my clients and students as well. And
Mm.
so, not that I don't use the word sex or sexuality, I do very liberally, but to speak
Mhm.
of this in a more all-encompassing, holistic way,
Yeah.
acknowledging the presence of the erotic just tends to feel more accurate to me.
Ugh, God, you're speaking my language, woman. Yes.
Yeah.
I feel, yeah, that the power of how eroticism holds such a larger scope of what we're
Mhm.
really talking about.
Mhm.
So I'm going to come right back to where you were. But the third place I want us to go today is you've just done this amazing journey on Netflix
Yeah.
called Sex, Love, and Goop with Gwyneth
That
Paltrow.
happened.
That
That
happened.
happened.
Oh my God. And it was so badass. And your work with that couple, those women, was amazing. So I want to make sure we get to that as well.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
let's go back to what you just seeded, which is
Mhm.
your work around eroticism and maybe beginning with your own journey and the intersection to what you do now as an erotic wholeness coach.
Mhm. Mhm.
So
Yeah.
however you want to begin.
Yeah. Well, I mean, gosh, if we really, really begin at the beginning,
Mhm.
there was a story my dad liked to tell. He passed away 13 years ago. So this
Mm.
is, these stories are old. Um, of when I was 2 weeks old, he was laying in the bathtub with me on his chest, and he had a big barrel chest. And so little baby me, and I was not Darshana at the time. I had not received that
Ah,
name, which is an initiated name I received further down the line. I was
uh-huh.
Jessica, and that's not a secret. But so
Okay.
little baby Jessica on dad's chest, and he had something like a gestalt type experience, and came away with a lot of insight into me as a person. And the big theme was, she's going to be really into sex.
Really?
I mean, I suppose it's worth saying, like, my
Yeah.
dad was a hippie who had by that point mainstreamed, but like Woodstock, all the drugs, all the things.
Awesome.
And so, I mean, there,
Oh my God. Free
a
spirit.
little relevant context. But and I get that that could sound very weird and creepy to some people, like a father with his infant daughter having this experience, and it really wasn't. I mean, it was held in a way, and when I learned about that further down the line, I mean, obviously that was not what I would like my marching orders from infancy were not to live into that prophecy. It was more that I like to say, you know, my parents, like, they put the fun and dysfunctional, and gosh, did they do a lot of things in ways I wish they hadn't. But they were not sex negative, which is not the same thing as me saying they were sex positive, but they were definitely not sex negative. And whether it was because my dad had that understanding, or it was just the way that they were navigating parenting, like, I was actually given a lot of permission to explore my sexuality as early on as I wanted to. There was not a lot of restriction or prohibition. I very distinctly remember when I was in high school and first became more active sexually speaking, I had younger, formative, like, curious experimentations, all same sex. And this was, now I'm speaking about the time when I began as a cisgendered woman connecting with cisgendered men, and my high school boyfriend was allowed to, like, sleep over. We were allowed to close the door. It was like, it was not, I don't know that my parents were so intentional about this as to be like, well, we'd rather her be under our roof. Like, I just think they were cool with it. So that's, you know, if we really want to begin at the beginning, there's some background for you. Yeah. And I went on to get married very young, which surprised me more than anybody. But I met and fell in love with someone who was from a different country. My ex-husband is Chilean. I was living in Chile at the time. We were young and impulsive, and it made a lot of sense to us. Me as a 22-year-old, him as a 24-year-old, we're like, we should get married because that's going to make life a lot easier for us to be together, travel together, do the things we want to do. And so we did. And we had a 6-year journey together. And during those 6 years, it would never have even occurred to me that I would be sexual with anybody other than him. Like, monogamy was all I knew. And I thought that our sex was pretty good. If I complained about anything, I complained that I wasn't having enough of it, but I wasn't complaining about the sex. And then we got divorced. and then I started having sex with other people. And there's this way of, like, you don't know what you don't know, right? Exactly. And we all have that. And so really that's where I usually begin my story when people ask for it. Is I'm separated from the person I had been exploring my sexuality with for 6 years. And I am deeply devoted and invested to a yogic path at that time of my life as my main spiritual journey. And it happened that the lineage that I was part of in those early days is a monastic order. It's very, like, even though there's yoga asana practice, which presumably is about you being in your body, I can look back now and say it was a very disembodied teaching and there was no eroticism. There was no presence of the divine feminine embodiment. And so, you know, the divine feminine was something to be put up on an altar and worshiped as a statue, but not something that was being taken into our bodies. Wow. And the long and the short of that part of the story is that here my spirituality was proving to be such a potent and enlivening and compelling facet of my life. And that was happening over in this corner. And then over here in this corner, I'm dating, I'm having sexual encounters with different people. All of a sudden I'm waking up and I'm saying, like, whoa, I've never done this before. And I didn't know I like this. And it's like, so there's yet another facet of my life that's really compelling and enlivening. Yeah. And yet the two felt so separate from each other. And so that's really where this started, because I didn't feel good in that separation. And I don't even know that I would have articulated it in such an intentional way then, but I wanted integration. Yeah. You know, that I deeply wanted that. Yeah. And so because yoga, then tantra is my early origin story. I was, you know, really deeply established in and, you know, now I can look back with certain questions around cultural appropriation and who I was learning from and so on and so forth. And there's a lot to be said about that portion of my journey that I look at now through a critical lens in a good way, I think. But, you know, yoga and a lot of Hindu-based tradition was a huge part of my life, and it was lighting me up, but there was not space for, even though the word dakini came in as a sexually liberated, empowered woman who uses that as medicine, if you will, you know, a gift that she's carrying to her people. That notion started coming in for me more as I began to explore tantra, and was introduced through different people, and then a particular partner who I had a short, fiery connection with. But the fire was a catalyst.
Yeah.
And it really lit up the part of me that was starving, actually, for that integration and for a different way of being in my own feminine embodiment. And so it was at that time that I made some huge changes in my life that looked like a move from East Coast to West Coast, a transition from a corporate career. Not everybody knows this about me. Like I had a very like serious corporate job. Like, I mean, like, yeah, I business suits and, you know, like flying all over the place. And I did that version of life, and that was interesting. That happened. And mostly it afforded me the ability to really dive deep into things that I was more passionate about, mainly yoga. And then that became the bridge. So I parted ways with that. I had that catalyzing relationship that introduced me to a lot of new scopes of possibility. It moved me out to California, where I live now. And landing here, I had a very serendipitous series of events, and it really is a chapter of my life that I can look back on now and say, like, yeah, the universe was conspiring, like, very much in a clear, direct way to say, this is the path.
Wow.
It was not, I had this vague, loose idea when I decided to part ways with corporate life and jump out on a limb here, that I would be a coach who maybe guided other corporate people around having a more fulfilling spiritual life. Because, you know, I was looking around at my circumstances and like, well, what am I supposed to do here? Sex was not in the mix. Like, I did not set out initially to become a sex and intimacy coach, and erotic wholeness as a concept and a body of work didn't exist then. Not in there, you know, like that's something that has emerged through years of this journey and of being in practice. So I'm trying to make this not the longest story ever.
It's great. Keep going.
I basically landed in a network of dakinis, and not all of them would necessarily identify as such, and some of them absolutely would. Many of them are very covert. They're in the world doing big, beautiful things, but it may not be that it's like, oh, I am the sexually liberated woman who's bringing her gifts to the world, you know. So but a lot of it centered around women's embodiment work and a way of exploring what it is to be in our bodies, to lead from a place of feminine wisdom. And I want to be conscientious here, like, you know, I'm using terms feminine and woman, and a lot of the spaces that I have hung out in have been centered around the experience of a very cisgendered, heteronormative, you know, orientation. And that's been part of the evolution too, of queering this inquiry. That's another piece that has come in subsequently. But at that time in my life, I landed in California. I knew next to nobody. I made a bold ask of a woman by the name of Lisa Schrader, whose body of work and brand is Awakening Shakti. Lisa's amazing. And I was like, somehow I had gotten introduced to her. I think I listened to her on a podcast or something or other. And I wrote her an email and I was like, hey, I'm coming to your neck of the woods and I'd really like to meet you. Are you open to that? And her response was something like, I don't do in-person sessions, and yes. Like, so Lisa deserves to be named here as a very pivotal moment where she said yes to me. We had this super powerful session in her backyard in Nevada City, California, you know, years back. She introduced me to a community where I went on to meet another dear sister on my path, Robin Lynn, who was very much a gatekeeper for me in a good way, and or maybe it's better to say a bridge. She introduced me both to a lot of humans who informed my path in beautiful ways, and was my bridge into Sri Vidya Tantra, which is a goddess worshiping, classically oriented tantric path that absolutely does include and invoke feminine embodiment. So that's all happening. I end up traveling a lot. I'm in Bali, I'm in India, I'm in Thailand, I'm studying, I'm practicing, I'm being initiated, I'm teaching, I like all these things are happening. And the world of sex work opens up to me in many different forms. I'm meeting women who have been offering their gifts and earning their living in a wide variety of ways. And that led me to things like somatica, where you and I met, and sexological body work, which is another modality that I'm certified in. And that definitely, with the show with Sex, Love, and Goop, people are really hooked into that facet of it, which totally makes sense. It's an amazing body of work. And I've been, going around like gathering up tools to put into the toolkit, some of which are very expressly focused on sex and intimacy, like somatica and sexological body work, but also trauma-informed work that I've done, study with neuroaffective touch and somatic experiencing. And then the big piece, that you and I were speaking of privately before we got on for this call, a body of work called Soulcraft, which is Bill Plotkin's, that I am a deep student of, and a community that is really dear to me, that looks at so this notion of wholeness arises from that we are these multifaceted beings. We are souls in bodies, and our souls are here to embody and to impart a unique gift to life. And at the risk of that sounding very woo, because it to me, it actually feels very grounded and very accurate, that we all have something we're here to do. Some of us will do that through our work, not all of us. I want to be super clear, because anytime I talk about this, it doesn't mean that everybody's got to turn around and become an erotic wholeness coach. It means that everybody has the opportunity to take a journey to finding what really lights them up and what is the genuine, authentic expression of their soul. And that's not an easy thing to do, living in the dominant culture that we are in, which has us so effectively severed from body and soul and heart, that it's, it can seem utterly impossible. But again, that's my journey. Those are the primary influences that have brought me to a place where this notion of erotic wholeness has come to be, because there's space for our sexuality in there, but also it's inclusive of our sensuality and what it is to be part of a deeply sensuous web of life, an animate world that we are woven into. It includes our emotions and all the ways that we feel, because there's a difference between our feeling and our sensing, our hearts and our bodies. There's space there for the dynamism of relationship. We exist in series of concentric circles of relationships, human and more than human, and to be engaging with those, to me, is an erotic expression, how we choose to relate. And then a big piece that came in for me is our activism. To me, is an expression of Eros. And we live in a time where social justice has come to the forefront, and people who have never considered themselves especially politicized are very activated in that way. And we're looking at the inequities and the antiquities, systems of oppression that have ultimately caused legacies of harm for all of us. There's nobody, doesn't matter where you are in that system, you're being harmed, right? We are being harmed. And so I have come to feel erotic aliveness as one and the same as really aligned activism.
Mm.
And that brings us here.
Yes. Oh my gosh. This is so rich. Okay. There's a couple things I want to go back to. And thank you for bringing that forward so fully. Wow. I didn't know that you had such a deep tantric background, first of all.
Yeah.
Um, okay. So there's all these little things I've tagged. I want to go back to this partner that you had after your marriage,
Hmm.
where there was this fire and it just
Hmm.
blew something open and it
Hmm.
kind of directed you towards this body of work, and
Yeah.
so to speak. Can you say a little bit more about what awakened in you
Yeah.
in the exchange?
Well, if I look back at it and I speak in the language of archetypes
Yeah.
and energies, I actually think that he was a far more embodied feminine than I was
Uh-huh.
at the time. And I had a lot more of my masculine online in healthy ways. He might not agree with this. So if you're listening, but I see it as there's a way where the gift we had to give each other
Mhm.
was that polarity where I was so enraptured by this beautiful man who actually was living in a more feminine way, more fluid, more dynamic, very deeply committed to his tantric practice, a permaculture teacher, like super
Mm.
connected to the earth. Beautiful. I mean, he's gorgeous, like I was so physically attracted to him, but I was so spiritually and energetically intrigued by how he moved in the world so differently. At that
Yeah.
point in time, I was still corporate career, like,
Mhm.
I had owned my home, I had my good credit, I was doing all the things that like are
Check,
markers
check,
of
check.
success. And and I did that, bear in mind, I got married at 22 and I started doing all that stuff in my early and mid 20s. So
Okay.
my 30s, which is what we're talking about now, were actually more of where I was like doing the wild experimentation version of things, like falling for this gorgeous guy who hadn't had a permanent address in years, who was a total gypsy,
Uh-huh.
and traveling all over the place. And I'm like, okay. And really like the nature of our meeting, like very, very quickly after, he's like, I'm going on a cross-country road trip. And I'm like, great, so am I. I'm getting rid of my house. I'm getting rid of my belongings. I'm like,
Goodbye,
it was
corporate
great.
world.
Yeah, not even,
Not
that was the
yet.
great thing. I
Oh,
kept working for
from the
several
road?
months on the road through
Fantastic.
through our breakup. And it's a
Yeah.
gift, like that actually gave me, because my integrated masculine at that time really knew how to get shit done, knew how to
Totally.
adult, knew, like I actually have a lot of mastery in that arena. And yet there was something just like imbalance. There was disproportionate energy. And he was an initiator for me into bringing more of my feminine online.
Beautiful. Oh
Yeah.
my gosh, this is so gorgeous. This is one of my favorite things about what sexuality does is it's like,
Hmm.
especially when you're on a spiritual journey with it,
Yeah.
because in a way, traditionally we would say, the man has a certain role and the woman has a certain role, just culturally long ago.
Right. Sure.
But it's like when you start talking about energies, he was awakening some part of your own feminine energy that wanted
Hmm.
to come on
Yeah.
board more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I could also say that I think this is accurate. I mean, I had had some really profound and beautiful couplings and partnerings and loverships prior to that I felt showed me so much more of what was possible. But in this relationship, I think was really the first time that such a deep and intentional consciousness was brought
Mm.
to our sex,
Yes.
and that sex became sacred,
Oh,
truly, and that sex was not purely about the get off. It wasn't about just like how quickly can we orgasm, or how wild can we be, or whatever some of the other things that I might have reached for in sex previously, because those were the cultural scripts that I was handed, and it was really all I knew.
yeah.
In that container is where tantric practice came in, and our really, where we would sit. And I remember we were working through one of Margot Anand's workbooks together, and then it was like a year later, this is a true story, a year later, I land in Margot's lap, truth, physically. at a gathering in Bali, and I move into her house for like a month, and it's like, I'm just like, wait a second, like this is my world. Like this is not what I thought I was doing. But that was where that all got seeded, that I started to understand that, again, going back to me saying earlier, it was like there was like yoga and sex, spirituality and sexuality, and that was where they started to come together, was in my partnership there, where we took sex on as a spiritual practice.
Yeah.
And I began to understand that it could be a pathway to so much more than the physical alone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm so glad you're bringing that point up, because it reminds me of something. I know we're going to get to the Netflix series, but there's a couple in the beginning, and they're working with the difference of their sexual erotic blueprint. Let's say their sexual desires, what turns them on. And what was beautiful is the man discovered that while he had been conditioned to believe that sex, penetrative sex and getting off was what turned him on, through the exercises, he realized that like energetics was
Right.
such a big part. He had a full body orgasm right there on the camera.
Yeah, which was so beautiful.
It was so beautiful.
Oh my
And I think
gosh.
that is the sacred piece you're talking about.
Yeah.
What is eroticism when we can actually dismantle the conditioning and the scripts
Yeah.
and be in our body together and discover each other moment to moment?
Yeah.
So I really appreciate you bringing that piece in of your story.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, gosh, it's a tender in the best possible way moment to because this is not always the conversation I'm coming onto a podcast to have, and I'm really appreciating that. And it's like, yeah, for me, this path that I'm walking is deeply service oriented. Like one of my little slogans that's out there is, I am nurturing a culture of erotic wholeness. I take that very seriously in the way of like, this is my soul's work. This is the commitment that I'm here to fulfill. And it's incredibly beautifully gratifying to know that like these little nuggets from earlier on in my journey can now be referenced and be sources of inspiration.
Exactly.
Like, great that I got to experience that. And it is great. I was having a lot of fun. I was getting lit up. I was also being shredded and dismantling so many layers of my own identity and contacting grief and rage in massive ways. So let's be clear, the erotic does not discriminate, and it is not all bliss and orgasms. But I love that that those little morsels get to come up as offerings now. Like that is where the way in which we are woven into a web of life together, and that this is culture building work. Like, yeah, here it is. Like, I get to tell a story of something that happened then that informed all this, and it gets to be a source of inspiration. And how beautiful is that?
How beautiful. You're right. I mean, our stories, our history is it's so inspiring when we can actually share and see the links of how things have built the larger frame that we're sitting in. Yeah. Okay. So the second piece I wanted to go to in this arc that you shared is, you said when you got to Bali, you were meeting all these people that were doing sex work and that it opened something in you. So can you say a little bit more about what some of these people were doing and what it evoked in you?
Yeah. Well, at that time, I was in a very small experimental community, intentional and experimental, of tantrikas, of whatever that word might mean to people, and some people might not know that word, but are organized around, not organized by, but organized around a dear beloved mentor of mine, David Cates, who his history is so rich, and he's been, he's definitely like an erotic elder for me. I'm not going to sit here and go into everything that David was a part of, but he's been around, and also is super low profile and low key and hard to find. So don't all go Googling him.
Actually, I want to clarify one thing before you share more about David.
Yeah.
For listeners who don't necessarily know what tantrika is, should we just do a quick description energetically?
Sure.
Or
it makes me curious to ask you what your association with that word is, as a starting point.
Totally.
Yeah.
So I'm not currently, but for quite a while, I was in a Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And the tantrika for me was sort of, it's a catalyzing energy of awakening.
Mhm.
And it has that erotic power because I feel erotic power is our life force. It
Mhm.
has this
Agreed.
pure, crystalline clarity, and like laser sword that is loving and fierce all at the same
Mhm.
time, is kind of cutting through to bring things to the surface that are shadowy.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I agree with all of that. And another metaphor that I like to invoke is tantrikas are weavers.
Oh, yeah.
Weaving to get, that is one of the words that tantra is interpreted as, to weave. And so it's this bringing together of seeming opposites. And
Mm.
we are acculturated to so much binary compartmentalization. And
Yeah.
so Tantra is like the antithesis of that. It's how do you stand in full presence and full relationship with the whole,
Mm.
right? So in a way, Soulcraft is tantric practice.
Yes.
If you look at it, like it is the inclusion of the excluded. It is the pairing of the opposites. It is
Mm.
the like bringing shadow to light, and yeah, that's what it really is about. The word, as I was using it, and I think it gets done like in a more derivative way, is that like there's neo tantra, which is kind of like what happened to yoga, where the West gets a hold of something and gets myopically focused on particular facets of a much wider body of wisdom, and then presents it as tantra.
Yeah.
So that's where like the heavy emphasis on sexuality in westernized neo-tantric practice happened, because very little of true, whether it's Buddhist or Hindu origined tantra, like very little of it has to do with sex.
Yeah.
And yet in the
Exactly.
West, we think it's all about sex. And so I'm acknowledging too, for myself, that might seem a little hypocritical or paradoxical, because we're having this conversation about tantra and tantrikas in base of me referencing sex work.
True.
So I'm aware.
You're bringing well, you're just expanding the
Right.
larger scope of what it really,
Yeah.
this is one
But
facet.
yeah, when I'm using the term sex work, I'm speaking to a very broad scope of work, and it's a polarizing term for a lot of people, triggering even, because there are absolutely facets of sex work that are done in god awful ways, non-consensual, people being exploited, and particularly the more vulnerable your identity, the more exploitation you're subject to. So this is where people who are underage, people who are immigrants, people of color, trans folks can find themselves, not that it's exclusive to them, but again, more vulnerability is more vulnerability here. And so sex work has this very confusing rep, right? Because
Yes.
people are like, wait, are you talking about trafficking? Are we talking about like pimps and prostitutes here?
Right.
And the community that I was a part of had no, 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 just not even anywhere near that. Who I was meeting were a group of very empowered, educated women. That was my community. Who had chosen for various reasons to find themselves providing erotic experiences for money.
Yeah.
And primarily that looked like what is considered like a tantric session in that wider scope of sex work is a very sensuous, spiritually grounded massage, where there's a lot of breath, and there might be some energetic play, and there might be some ritual, and yes, genitals are included.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the common lexicon would be like, it's a happy ending massage.
Right.
And if you talk to a practitioner of that work, and I'm speaking myself included, if you talk to me, what I'll tell you is it's a gorgeous ceremonial space where the dakini, the tantrika, the practitioner provides an invitation into a sacred relating of deep presence. And so when you consider that most of the people who seek out these services are men, cisgendered men, many of them heterosexual men, who are following the script of this is what it is for me to be a cishet man in the dominant culture, that does not make space for their softening open into presence, that does not make space for a slow sensuous experience. And that's what was happening there in those kind of sessions. And so that was my formative experience. I got introduced to that work and to these wonderful women who I apprenticed to, a dear friend, she took me under her wing and showed me what was possible. And it was like, oh my God. And I'm college educated, had the corporate career, like clearly I'm at choice here. I had a lot of access and a lot of privilege, and I could have done a million things, just like so many other people could. And so the call of the Dakini, that really is strong in this storyline, because it was a sense of like, oh, this is mine to do. And that was not ultimately the arena that I built a full out career for myself in. That was an introduction that led me to the work that I do now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. This is so rich. I mean, you can probably see the tears in my eyes. I was just feeling this, joy and grief all at the same time, imagining these men that you're describing coming and getting to access a depth of their own being, and how it's so true that there is sex work that is pretty disconnected and disembodied.
Absolutely.
But then there's this whole other world, and that is so much about integration and embodiment and healing and bringing people into contact with deeper aspects of their own self.
Yeah.
So it just moves me, because I think the world would be so different if there was access to people being able to be held in that loving way, to access more of who they truly are, because this dominant culture of power over, and I just did a program on toxic masculinity and just these traits of stoicism and emotional repression and the impact that it's had on people, and the implications of the violence and aggression in the world as a result of this.
Absolutely.
So moved.
Yeah. And that last mention of violence and aggression, that's there was such a resonance with what I'm feeling, is that what I was embodying, what the other practitioners are embodying. I mean, you can play with all different energetics here, right? It could be very playful, it could be flirty, it could be, very power dynamic oriented, playing into the role of Dom. But ultimately, to me, the main transmission was nurturance.
Yes, that's what I was feeling.
Like so there is an empowerment for the woman to be able to fuse, like we have this Madonna whore paradigm, right? That it's very polarized. You can be one, you could be the other, but we get super confused. We want to bring them together. And yet that is effectively the exact thing going on here, is that the nurturance and the sexuality are integrated and embodied in this woman, this practitioner, this Dakini, me, this community I was a part of, so many hundreds of thousands of millions of sex workers out there who are working, with this kind of intention and awareness, that they're providing that. And I want to say it's, like we talk a lot about toxic masculinity and assign a lot of responsibility to men around that, like that it's your issue and it's your thing to solve. But there's a piece here that I think is important to say, which is that something I really came to learn through this work is the ways that I, as a woman, uphold that, that it's very internalized in me. And something that's so liberating about having a practitioner-client relationship is that the nurturance that I'm providing is not being conflated with the nurturance of preparing meals, cleaning house, a lot of the very woman-oriented tasks that are part of that script that we're running and playing into, that end up degrading intimate connection in relationships. Like I get to come in with a purity of nurturance that is not being bogged down by having to tend to all these domestic duties on behalf of my man. I just get to flow this abundant erotic energy. And earlier you said something that I agree with, that erotic energy is life force energy. 110%. I agree with that. And so it's like it's like the channel's really clear as a practitioner. You just get to like flow that through and offer it up to this man who all of a sudden is like, wow, my wife probably, because a lot of these men are married and have families that they are deeply devoted to. And so the choice to seek out a practitioner is actually a choice to honor their family Like, there's so much confusion around this. They're looking for a way to get a need met that they might not even know how to articulate to themselves. And I don't want to make excuses. I'm not saying that this is every single person is doing things in integrity, but most of my clients were really solid people, like just who are just like, yeah, I need a space to connect to my body, to connect to my heart, to be shown how to do these things. When I was doing this work, one of the things that I offered were bathing rituals, where I would literally put a man in a bathtub and I would kneel at the side and pour water over him and wash his body. And there's something so vulnerable and intimate and tender about that. And absolutely it can be sexualized, but it's not seedy. It's sexual. Like there's, when the quality of presence is there and when it's being done as an act of reverence, it's devotion. It's a very different thing. And we're hungry for that. I think we're hungry to give it. And we're hungry to receive it. And we don't always understand that. We could be hungry for both at the same time. We don't always have language to articulate it. But to be in this very devotional exchange with someone, I feel like that is a true, oh gosh, I'm looking for the right word here. Like that is an authentic expression of Eros that is so sublimated right now for the vast majority of us, and so we yearn for it, but we don't even know. Like there's a lot of layers to clear out before most of us would ever get to a place of articulating that that's what we're after, that's what we want to feel. And anyway, I feel like I'm on such a tangent
so
here,
gorgeous. But oh my gosh. Okay, I want to come back to a couple things you just said, because and I just want to acknowledge you right now, because I feel like you're doing such a good job bringing in some very taboo topics and showing that there's this huge range. Like we talk about sex workers and you were talking about prostitutes and pimps and like the whole range. But I feel like what our conversation feels like it's doing to me, at least right now, is it's opening this portal. And I hope that this is what listeners receive, is that while all that's true, there's this whole other world over here, and you may not have a name for it, but if you have this yearning or this sense in your body that something is missing, there's a sense of like needing to open something or longing for, maybe it's nurturance, I don't know what people would call it, that there is another way to actually get initiated, whatever gender you are. And I agree with you. This whole toxic masculinity, it's really about all genders right now. It's a mindset. It's qualities and beliefs of conditioning that have kept us so small. And how do we all reinforce that?
Yeah.
And I think,
because it's a cultural paradigm. At this point, it is a dominant cultural paradigm. And so, yes, it does not actually matter your gender, your sexual orientation. We are, just as we are all contributing to the system of oppression that is racism, for instance, which is, like, it does not matter. We are, we're in it. Yes. And so but instead of that feeling like a situation of powerlessness, it can be very empowering when you realize, oh, I'm part of this. This is in me, and thus I am at choice. Yeah. Like I can choose to wake up and get educated, do my work of decolonization, of dismantling. And that's where that activism piece, as like activism as Eros as activism, that to me is part and parcel of the same journey. Because if we go back to the root that we both have touched on of saying like the erotic is life force, like so how do we use this to enhance life, improve life, serve life? That's what it's all about. So yeah, have your
Yes.
orgasms, have your great sex, like I please do, like, but there's a bigger game we're playing here.
A much bigger game. And
Yeah.
I feel that's what you're putting color on. It's like these
Yeah.
branches, and you just keep painting these different pieces. I feel like we could have 5 different conversations on
I
this because
know.
there's just
Thanks
so
for hanging in
much.
there with me.
Oh my God, it's so good. I mean, this is my jam. I feel so. Let's transition because I'm aware of the time.
Yeah.
It feels really important to have you come back to this other piece of your heart, which is the Plotkin work and the
Hmm.
activism. So
Yeah.
maybe you could share a little bit about what that is, how that's blending into this, and then we'll
Yeah.
go into Netflix and Goop.
Yeah, sure. Sure. Well, so Animas Valley Institute, which is Bill's organization, there are kind of two facets or two bodies of wisdom within that. And one of them is Soulcraft and one of them is Wild Mind. And it's funny, I often use the term Soulcraft because it's a little more known. But really my deep devotion in that world is to Wild Mind, which is a map of our psyche, if you will, that shows us these different facets of ourself that when we are operating from our highest, when we are in our wholeness, we are an integrated human contributing to the world in good ways. And the reality for most of us is that we're not there yet, that we're still very fragmented, and that we might look like adults on the outside, but inwardly and psycho-spiritually, we're adolescents. Like we don't get to grow up fully. And that is not a personal response. Well, it's a personal responsibility in that when we become aware of this, we have a choice to do something with it. But again, this is a cultural norm. Like everything in our dominant culture encourages us to stay in that adolescence, to be more pliable, to not question things, to just go get on the hamster wheel of the industrial growth complex and capitalism and consumerism and never get off.
Totally.
So it's a big thing here to make a choice to do something different. And so the Wild Mind map talks about like our facets of wholeness, and it also talks about our sub personalities. So we could call this, our better nature, and then the saboteurs, if you will. And that's a simplification. But basically that work changed me. When I on so many levels, and I have been, like I said, a deep student of Bill's. He's a beloved mentor, and there are many guides within that organization who are really dear to me. And that map is the foundation of the map of erotic wholeness.
Yes.
So what I did through my work was see everything that the Wild Mind map was giving me, and I created my own version, which is the map of erotic wholeness that follows that same premise and looks at the facets of our sexuality and becoming sexual beings and erotic human beings, and the parts of ourselves that keep us immature, that keep us playing out patterns that do not serve. And I've created this journey that is how do we walk through the map of erotic wholeness, and it's very deeply inspired by Bill's work. So I hope that was an answer to your question. I could talk all day about this, and I'm trying to keep it brief.
We have so many wormholes we could go down, but
Yeah.
yes, because the reason I asked it is because I could feel in you how deeply it's influenced you.
Yeah, huge.
And so I wanted to make room for it. And I think
thank you.
It's gorgeous that that's what's informing the map of how you work with people in this erotic wholeness. Yeah. So before we go to Goop, maybe you could say a little bit more about, for people who are looking to expand more into their wholeness, and or they're finding themselves stuck in their sexuality or their erotic expression in some way. How do you help people, and what does the sexological body work and all of that? I mean, this is kind of a layered question, but I realize I'm making it too layered. Maybe I'll back up and just say, what do you do for people, and how do they find you if they want to learn more? I know that your information will be in the show notes, but
yeah. Well, pre-Goop, mostly I was a private practitioner who offered some group work, very small group sizes. And now that's changing. And this journey around the map of erotic wholeness is something that I am bringing forward in bigger group format. And at this point, it is exclusively for women and feminine folk. And that probably won't change, but I also see that there is going to be a need for it to become available to people of all genders. And I look forward to finding out who that dharma belongs to, if it's not me, you know.
Right.
And so, yeah, the ways that I work with folks, I mean, it's so interesting because I'd love to have the perfectly succinct nugget to say here. It's different for different people because we all have a different entry point. And I think that, you know, one of my superpowers and gifts is that I've met people where they're at, and I've been able to find like what are the right pieces of my own wisdom, the tools in my toolkit to bring to them at any given moment to help them find their way onto the path and keep marching, as it were. And that does look different for different people. But fundamentally, you know, most folks come to me because there's something that they feel is wrong with their sex life. It's, you know, so these are very relatable things, whether it's that you're in pain or you don't know how to access pleasure, you're in a relationship and there's, oh, we love each other, we're best friends, but our intimate life sucks. You know, things that would be very common and relatable for most people because we've known them ourselves at some moment in time, or we know somebody who's had that struggle. So that's usually what gets somebody in the door. And I might be, you know, doing a little bit of ruining the mystery here, but I like to say people like they come for the sex, but they stay for like the deep transformation and healing work.
Yes.
And that is what it's about. You know, our sex is not separate from all of us. And so when we, you know, if that happens to be the entry point for a particular individual's journey, so be it. But ultimately what we're going to end up doing is looking at your childhood wounds and your protective strategies and the ways that you are blocking yourself from living into the full capacity of your soul's gifts in the world and showing up in your wholeness for yourself, for all your relations, you know, the dear close in ones, and then the widening circles that extend out from there. And a big part of that is helping people to understand about how we hold and metabolize trauma or don't metabolize it and need guidance around that. Attachment material. Yes, we absolutely do a lot of embodied practice and there's inquiry into how do you learn what feels good? How do you learn about your desires and preferences, but also your boundaries? There's so much, a huge connection on how we relate to the natural world is woven in there. You know, I've mentioned it in brief throughout our conversation, but we are sensuous creatures who are alive and part of a very sensuous world. And when I use that term, I invite people to think about sensuous senses, touch, taste, smell, feel, hear, right? So when we look at our erotic nature through that lens, sex is a part, but not the whole. And since this is wholeness work, we need to be including and tending to all of that, not our sex alone. And I'm going to segue us into sex, love, and goop because I know that's on your agenda by saying that I'm deeply proud of the work I did there. I'll say that. Super proud of it. And you see so little of it, y'all.
Right.
That was not an hour. That was days of experience in a very intensive container. And Chandra and Camille were so brave and available to the journey. And it makes perfect sense to me why what ended up on the screen ended up on the screen. I really do feel good about how the narrative was shaped. And that's a portion of it.
Right.
You know, that was a much bigger piece of work. It's not like, you know, Chandra was the person who her struggle was growing up with really extreme religious conservatism and there being a correlation between that formation and her inability to receive penetrative touch without pain. So, you know, spoiler alert if you haven't seen the show, but I hope you will see the show, you know, like Chandra coming to a place where she can receive penetrative touch without pain wasn't the result of 30 minutes or an hour, like that was, you know, a deep diving journey that we co-created together, where she got to look at many pieces along the way. And Camille, her fiance, they are engaged to be married.
Oh, yeah.
Camille ended up confronting, very surprisingly to her, a lot of internalized shame and body image material, and a way that she was orienting toward her sex in a very performative way.
Yeah.
That's like, oh, I'm supposed to do this. The script says that, so I show up and I do the thing. When in actuality, there was a huge disconnect, and she was not feeling safe and was not fully available. And the arc of our work together brought her into a place where she could truly be connected to self. And there's a quality of surrender in that. Like she surrendered the armor that is, oh, I'm following the script, because that is a version of armor, you know, like we numb ourselves out, we block ourselves, protect ourselves from what's actually tender and vibrant and alive within. And she got to contact some of that, and it brought her into an ecstatic state unlike anything she'd ever known before. But again, these were gorgeous moments that really did happen, unscripted, like no one, you know, like there was no way to force that.
Exactly.
And it is part of a bigger journey.
Yeah, I appreciate you naming that. And for those of you who haven't seen the show, it's on Netflix, and it's 6 episodes. Is that right?
It's 6 episodes. They're roughly 30 minutes each. And our storyline that I'm speaking of here, myself with Chandra and Camille, is in episodes 3, 4, and 6.
That's okay, great. And it's called Sex, Love, and Goop.
Yep.
But I want to go back to one piece, because it was so beautiful when you helped her realize in that moment she was going into the performative thing with the toy. And then you really just, I don't remember even the probing question, but she got it. She just looked at you and she was like, oh, that isn't really what I want.
Right.
You know, I'm not translating it correctly,
Yeah.
but I remember watching it going, that was fundamentally a massive shift of her saying, I'm not even being myself. I'm being who I was trained to be.
Exactly. And there were a couple of moments like that with Camille where there just a complete override of her authentic present moment needs and experience and boundaries and desires. Like all those things go together. Like, you know, like a need is a desire, is a boundary, is a, like they all kind of flow together depending on what angle you're looking at it from.
Right.
And most of us are really not in touch with those things because we are severely disconnected from our deep sensing, feeling bodies.
Exactly.
And so that is the fundamental work. And when we are more connected with our bodies, we're more empowered to make choices, advocate for ourselves, tend our relationships well. Yes. And that includes our relationship with the wider web of life that we are part of, and the more than human world that we are part of. And so all these things that we've talked about today, you know, that some of which are very provocative topics and have to do with how our spiritual practices might unfold, or how we get politicized and where our activism lies. Like, to me, the common ground is our body.
Yes.
So all of this is about a practice of embodiment and coming into ourselves well, occupying ourselves fully and well. And that's the journey.
That's the journey.
Simple, not easy. It's not easy, but it is simple conceptually. Like conceptually. Just about being in these bodies.
Yeah. And I think that's, for me personally, why the natural world is such a key element, because that's where I can't not be in my senses when I'm there. And then that reminds me more of who I am. So oh, Darshana, it is so amazing to have this conversation with you and to get a deeper sense of what you are doing in the world. And I'll look forward to following and seeing what you do next. And is there anything final you would want to say to the listeners about any of these topics? Or
I mean, this really has been such a beautiful conversation, Anne-Marie. So thank you for inviting it. I'm really touched. And what would I like to say? Yeah, what I want to say to those of you listening, this is one of my little Darshana-isms, but it feels really appropriate. We are erotic by nature and we are whole by choice. That's what I believe. So you get to make a choice to connect with and claim your erotic nature. It's there, it exists, you are erotic.
Yes.
So I say that with the hope that it inspires hope for those who might feel like this is really far out there, inaccessible, or that you're in a place where it's like, I'm never going to get turned on, I'm never going to this, I'm never going to, like, no, I say no to that lovingly. Like,
Yeah.
you are erotic by nature, that is a facet of being human. And so you've got the choice to make of how, if and how you're going to tend to that, turn toward that, claim that for yourself.
Mm.
And that's where the journey begins.
Gorgeous.
Mhm.
Thank you
Mm,
so much.
totally my pleasure.
So wonderful to be with you.